wanted to highlight a few trends that I'm seeing in data and then talk about the implications of that. So the first one we talked about is access to new types of data. We talked about that with drones and cars and with the Thermomix, but in the past, kitchen devices and a lot of other devices, they didn't track data and you didn't have access to those data. And up until recently, you weren't able to track those things. But in the past couple of years, things like Thermomix, Whirlpool has launched some connected devices as well. So things like ovens and refrigerators and blenders are all starting to be able to track things. And eventually I think that we'll see essentially everything in the kitchen tracking data and have the potential to also share those data. Whether or not they will share data with each other is to be determined, but more and more you have more access to data that you can do interesting things with. The second is historically applying AI to data has been constrained by having data scientists who can actually do the analysis. So an example of that is we saw a few years ago that cauliflower and coconut flour were trending in the United States, and we looked into that and it wasn't obvious to us why, but we found out that a lot of people were switching to low carb and paleo diets, and they were using cauliflower as a substitution for a grain-based ingredients. So people were making things like cauliflower crusts for pizza instead of using a grain-based crust for a pizza that has a lot of carbohydrates in it, using cauliflower, egg, and cheese, and similarly using coconut flour. And so we saw this trend early on before it's trending more and more now, but that was a really interesting insight that people could use for a variety of different applications, developing new products around shredded cauliflower, recipe generation, marketing, things like that. But that was one insight that took a person who's a specialist in data science to actually do that analysis. And as AI becomes more and more of a commodity, and you have things like TensorFlow or other things that make it easier to do AI-based data analysis, I think that you'll have more and more of these insights. And if you combine that with having access to more data, the number of insights just compounds from there. And then the third one is that, again, most of the insights have been historically constrained to the analyst, and that means that lay people do not have as much access to these insights. But more and more of these insights are becoming available to non-data scientists. So we've developed some of our own internal tools where our content team uses trends and predictions to come up with new emails or recipe ideas for our users. Our marketing team, similarly, our sales team is able to come up with trends and share those with brands and do a better job of selling and positioning and targeting their advertising. And so these trends, I think, have a few interesting implications. So the first is obviously with users. With the Thermomix, we talked about making it easier, not only easier, but to be able to make tastier food. And the Thermomix tracks a lot of data and helps you come up with the most perfect recipe. But you can imagine tracking anything in your kitchen and making a cake or baking something in the oven and then putting it in your Thermomix. But the more and more you have access to all of this data, you can track everything in every single appliance, track the outcomes of every single recipe, and converge on the most perfect recipe. You can also start personalizing recipes. So if we know that you like a barbecue or you like things crispier in the barbecue, we know how to do that in the oven. The oven can automatically oscillate the temperature up and down, and more machines will be able to make decisions for users. And cooking is really hard, and if machines can make it easier, then I think people will cook more, and these machines will be starting to make more decisions for users, which means that advertisers, that obviously has privacy implications, but also has advertising implications. If a machine is making a decision for you about what you're buying or how you're cooking, then an advertiser can pay to be part of that decision. And I think that this is a much better version of native advertising, because a user wants to be able to make a really good recipe, and if an advertiser can influence what they're buying and what ingredient they're purchasing and how they're using it, then that's a huge advertising opportunity. And then the last is that we touched on this a bit, but I think that the more that we're using data to optimize everything, the more that data is a currency, and the people who own the devices or who own that first step of the data have a huge leverage point. So you can imagine that Amazon just bought Whole Foods. You can imagine that Amazon knows exactly what you're buying. The Thermomix knows what you're cooking, or the oven knows what you're cooking. The refrigerator knows what you've eaten. A restaurant service knows where you've eaten, and each of these have a point of view on what your taste profile looks like and what you're eating. But in order to get the full picture on that, all of these things need to be talking to each other. Whether or not they will is to be determined, but having access to that data is a huge point of leverage and has a lot of implications both on business relationships and on privacy. So just in summary, I see that there's more and more access to data. AI can be applied more to those data. The insights are available to more and more people. And non-experts, that means that users are able to make better and tastier food. Advertisers can position themselves as machines make more of the decisions for them. Advertisers can take advantage of that. And the people who own the data have a huge point of leverage.